Today we have the very special privilege to welcome three American Japanese ladies who spent time in camps during World War II. And they don't like to call these camps internment camps because they were worse than just internment. On the other hand, they were also not Nazi-like concentration camps because they're survivable, which does mean that the deprivation, the shame, and the loss of many years of hard work, loss of financial, material, emotional, psychological well-being has been sacrificed by American Japanese, and it's only very recently that they are being recognized for what they have suffered during World War. So we are very privileged to have them here and hear their point of view. The secretary and executive member of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, Mrs. Sylvia Zucker, will introduce the speakers. And they are Mrs. Mei Nakano, Mrs. Shizu Iiyama, and Mrs. Kiku Funabiki. Is it correct? Mrs. Margaret Saiso. She is taking the place of another lady. Silva, this is your turn. Thank you very much.
Mei Nakano, a former instructor of English, is the author of Rico Rabbit, a children's book, and Japanese-American Women, 3 Generations. She also wrote and edited the curriculum guide, The Japanese-American Wartime Experience, for the Sonoma County Schools Office of Education. A human activist, she organized and headed a coalition of community groups to work successfully for the establishment of the Sonoma County Human Rights Commission. She is also a trained mediator for the nonprofit victim offender mediation group, REVORP. Last year, she had the honor of being one of 7 nominees for Woman of the Year awards for Vivian Braunschweig's Assembly, and received the Woman of Achievement Award from the Sonoma County YWCA. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mei Nakano.
Thank you, Sylvia. Appreciate that. I like to quote that remarkable human being, Wiesel, who on the occasion of the opening of the Holocaust Museum last year said this: "It is important to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. It is even more important to do something with the memory." His statement, as you might recall if you watched the Academy Awards presentations last week, echoed by Spielberg, who said, "Do not let this, the Holocaust, remain a footnote in history." And he implored the educators of the country to please teach it. So I think that we owe a real debt of gratitude to the Holocaust Study Center here at Sonoma State University for their on work, and I thank Dr. Steiner in person over here, a great debt for their ongoing work in keeping the memory alive and doing something with that memory. And the 3 of us, thank you for inviting us here today. We're here to keep alive another memory, as Dr. Steiner had mentioned, the memory of American concentration camps during World War II. This is not to suggest that camps to which we were subjected were anything like those of Nazi Germany, either in the scope or in the magnitude of their cruelty or inhumanity. I think that nonetheless we should bear in mind that this happened in this country and in this era, and the effects of what we underwent are still to be measured in terms of psychological damage and material loss. But more than that, I think that we need to bear in mind that when the constitutional rights of any citizen are violated, it violates everyone. I mean, it damages everyone. And our very way of life is in jeopardy. We Japanese Americans keep that memory alive, as the Holocaust Center does, so that such an episode will not happen again, and so that we can keep ever alert and vigilant to acts of bigotry that cause incidents like that. And believe me, some of us survivors feel the urgency of doing that, since we're mostly pushing 70s, and some of us are in our 80s. And so we're becoming a vanishing species. Not only that, our faculties are beginning to vanish too. So we need to do it in a hurry. Anyway, what I think we'll do today is see a film. It's another award-winning film by another Stephen, this time Stephen Okazaki of San Francisco. I think that you'll see the essential facts about the camps in this film. It's called A Days of Waiting. And you will note in this that the narrator says that she didn't think that her story would ever get told. And there she is telling the story, and here we are telling the story so that it will keep the memory alive. After which I will introduce the other two women, and they will share some of their personal memories of camp. Then we'll have a question and answer period. So if you have questions about either the film or something that we've said, I will ask you to hold it in abeyance until we finish with that part of it. Okay? Thank you very much.
Dear Carl, it was so good hearing from you after all this. I too have thought many times about our days in camp and the friends we had back then. Yes, I have considered writing about my experiences, my childhood, why I went to camp with Arthur, and what it was like during and after the war. So, for the record, this is my story. I was born in 1899 in Oakland, California. A year later, we moved to San Francisco, where Father worked as a landscape painter and piano tuner. Mother was an opera singer, a beautiful woman with a gorgeous voice. I rarely saw her. I never got to know her. Her nurse took me. My parents had not wanted children. They were too old and too busy to take care of a child. I guess I was a mistake. When I was 12, we moved to Los Angeles, and my parents sent me to live with a procession of relatives and strangers. It was an unhappy time. I was raped by one of my guardians who threatened to put me in an institution if I told. Back then, people who caused trouble were put away. After high school, I ran away from home. I roamed the streets alone, looking for adventure. Those were wild years. Eventually, I settled down and went to art school. I wanted to be a painter, like my father. In 1929, I met Arthur Ishigo. It was love at first sight. Born in San Francisco, Arthur had moved to Los Angeles to become an actor. He got a few bit parts, but ended up as a janitor at Paramount Studios. It was against the law for Caucasian women to marry non-Caucasian men in California, so we drove down to Mexico for our wedding. My family disowned me for good this time. Those days, there was a lot of prejudice against marriages like ours. So we stayed in the Japanese community and tried not to draw attention to ourselves. To get away, we went camping in the mountains if we could. Those were good times. I was happy. The Japanese had immigrated to America before the turn of the century to make better lives for themselves and their children. They worked as miners, railroad workers, and farm hands. And by 1940, many of them had begun to prosper. That all came to an end in 1941. On December 7th, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and President Roosevelt declared war on Japan. Although there was not a single act of espionage or sabotage by a Japanese American, newspapers and politicians cried for their removal and imprisonment. They voiced their loyalty to the United States, but no one would listen. On December 8th, one day after Pearl Harbor, Paramount discharged Arthur and all of the other Japanese Americans at the studio. 2 weeks later, I was fired from my job as a teacher at the Hollywood Art Center because of my Japanese name. We were American citizens, but we were treated as if we were the enemy. Under the cover of wild rumors and unjustified suspicions, the United States Western Defense Command declared that all persons of Japanese ancestry were to be placed under so-called protective arrest. Men, women, the elderly, even children with as little as 1/16 Japanese blood were commanded to leave the West Coast or be placed in concentration camps under Army supervision. More than 110,000 Japanese Americans, the majority of whom were Americans, fell under these orders. Arthur and I were faced with the choice of separating or going into the camps together. I could not desert him. I wanted to stay with him. No matter what happened, no matter where we were sent. We've been married for 13 years. Neither of us had ever felt a racial barrier, as I was trying to create one. It seemed like a foul, mossy sin dug up from the dark ages. 450 of us gathered at the church that early May morning. We stood in groups with our bundles and baskets piled at the curb. There was no way of knowing what we might need. We were allowed 100 pounds of bags, no more. Those with more than their allotment had to leave their things lying in the street. It was all so weird and strange. I took out my notepad and began sketching. Kindly Red Cross women brought trays of hot coffee, but nothing could quell the bitter weeping of some of the evacuees. The girl hid her face in her hands, began to cry, and was seized with a heart attack. Her family carried her into the church and stayed with her until she died. One at a time, the buses came. Armed military police stepped out and ordered us aboard. As we were driven through the city, a few bystanders stood up, staring and pointing at us, nodding their approval. We had no idea of where we were going or what would happen to us. Our new home was called the Pomona Assembly Center. Bewildered hundreds poured into the camp. Armed soldiers ordered us to line up to be searched. Photographers swarmed in to take our pictures, telling us to smile for the camera. Each family was given a number, a barrack assignment, and a mattress filled with straw. We were less than 25 miles from home, but it felt as if we were in a foreign land. Within a few weeks, more than 5 people were delivered to Pomona. We lived in horse stalls and cheap shacks, surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun towers. Each day, we stood in great long lines to get food. Once inside, we ate hastily to make room for all the others hungrily peering in through the windows. There was rarely enough to eat. Some of the young people would run from one mess hall to another to get their fill. Later, we found out that our meat supplies were being diverted from us and sold outside of the camp. The War Relocation Authority organized an internal police force made up of cooperative camp internees. Every night, they searched the barracks, opened our doors, turned their flashlights on. All who were able were assigned jobs to maintain the camp. Those who refused to work were blacklisted and threatened with being sent to the worst of the future camps. 19 of us volunteered together at Camp Bulletin, the Pomona Center News, with an old hand-turned mimeograph machine. We published stories about camp activities, trying to keep them upbeat, but realistic. On Visitors' Day, we went like prisoners to a fenced area where we could stand and talk for a short time. Under the watchful eyes of armed, we spent a few moments with friends and religious people from the outside. But this humiliating segregation, isolating us from our fellow Americans, was not enough. The time had come for us to be sent farther away. In August, we were shipped 1,000 miles to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Heart Mountain held 12,658 internees, living in hundreds of barracks in a square-mile enclosure. The people were half hungry and restless. Their feet trampled the earth into a fine dust, fenced area. It was a city unto itself. Babies were born. Children went to school, made friends, lost friends. Young people learned to dance, fell in love, went off to war. The old people in the steps of their barracks, brooding, frustrated, their life's efforts and hopes gone, waiting to once again live with human dignity. Some would die before the wait was over. A few grew desperate and took their own lives. I wanted to cry out, "Look what you've done." Why? It makes no sense at all. I hoarded scraps of paper and tried to write and draw what I saw. Perhaps one day someone would want to know. Heart Mountain lording over us as if it held the mystery of our name. Long lines of people waiting to be fed. Mothers with their children. The first snow in September. The icy winds and bitter cold. Shabby, shivering people with patches on their clothes. Christians, Catholics, and Buddhists gathering for Sunday services. Thousands of people with nothing to do but wait and watch the sunset. Then wait for the next day to begin. A child gazing longingly at the distant horizon. Our home and our country seemed so far away. Strange as it may sound, in this desolate, lonely place, I felt accepted for the first time in my life. The government had declared me a Japanese, and now I no longer saw myself as white, as a Hakujin. I was a Nihonjin, a Japanese American. My fellow Heart Mountain residents took me in as one of their own. We all shared the same pain, the same joys, the same hopes and desires. I never encountered a single act of prejudice or discrimination. We had to make the best of a bad situation. I obtained a violin and joined the camp orchestra and theater troupe, the Heart Mountain Mandolin Band. When we gave performances, no one could miss me. I was the Hakujin with the white hair. The main was to keep busy. I found a camera and took pictures of the camp children. Arthur and I never had children. Arthur worked as a boiler man. Day and night, he shoveled coal to heat the camp's hot water. When we were first interned, Arthur was strong and alive. In 3 years, he seemed to have aged 20 years. He grew morose and sentimental. In the evening, he would sit quietly or play his bamboo flute, reminiscing and dreaming of what might have been.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
The war ended in August of 1945. The nation celebrated and soldiers came home. The War Relocation Authority announced that Heart Mountain would close and that we would be able to leave. Suddenly, we were free. The government told us that we could go anywhere, do anything, take any kind of work we liked. The gate opened, but we had nowhere to go, nothing to go back to. I told Arthur I would record the last day in camp, and he agreed. I hid the drawings I had already done, and we waited for the last train. On November 10th, 1945, we were given $25 and transportation fare. We were poorly clad, dirty. We met prisoners onto the waiting buses and trains. I felt like I was part of a defeated Indian tribe. When we arrived in Los Angeles, there was no friendly greeting or even a smile. Nearly 2,000 of us who could not find jobs or a place to live, who found it difficult to readjust to American society, were hustled into state makeshift trailer camps outside the city. We were surrounded by barbed wire, but this time the gate was open. As we moved from one trailer camp to another, I continued to draw and paint the Japanese American children I lived with. Some of them were ashamed of their heritage. They refused to speak the language of their grandparents, and strangers, they were Chinese. Arthur and I took what work we could find to buy food and pay the rent. I worked at a cannery in San Pedro, while Arthur did odd jobs in Los Angeles. We lived in poverty for several years. I was another Japanese American band and continued to be part of the community. We provided entertainment at picnics, church programs, and community events. In 1948, the Attorney General was authorized to settle claims for the personal property losses we suffered. Arthur had made a list of everything we had lost when we were put in camp. We hoped to get at least $1,000. In 1952, the government offered us a settlement of $100. I decided that we should not accept this amount. And for the next 4 years, I lobbied and sent letters to every politician and civic leader I could think of. It was to no avail. In 1956, I finally gave up, and with tears in his eyes, Arthur accepted $102.50. 1 year later, on August 19, 1957, Arthur passed away from cancer. He was 55 years old. It was strange. I had so much anger inside of me. I wanted to scream and cry, but I couldn't. After Arthur's death, I adopted a stray cat and moved into an apartment above a store where I could climb up onto the roof and watch the stars. "15 years later, the California Historical Society included my artwork in a show devoted to internment camp artists. I was amazed. I had long ago given up hope that our story would ever be told. During the run of the exhibit, I thought of Arthur, our days in Heart Mountain, all that we had been through, and I wept. Dear Carl, sometimes it's so hard to keep smiling, but I keep trying. With greetings and best wishes, Estelle Ishigo." In 1983, a group of former Heart Mountain internees Estelle Ishigo in a rundown basement apartment in Los Angeles. She was living on $5 a week for food and had lost both of her legs from gangrene. She was placed in a convalescent hospital in Hollywood.
Mention that this garnered an Academy Award in 1992 for short documentaries. Now, let me introduce to you Chizu Iiyama, who comes from El Cerrito. Chizu is the Vice President, National Japanese American Historical Society, based in San Francisco, and is the co-chair of an exhibit sponsored by the Historical Society and is traveling under the aegis of the Smithsonian Institution. It's showing right now in Los Angeles. In fact, we've just come back from the opening there. She's also the past president of the El Cerrito Human Rights Commission, winner of many awards. Both she and Margaret were incarcerated at Topaz, Utah, called the Jewel of the Desert. Chizu?
Thank you very much. I want to share experiences with you, but I'll take you back to last year when I had an opportunity to go to a little spot in central Utah in the middle of a desert in a place called Topaz. It was 52 years since I had been there. And so as I stood on that sun-baked soil, looking out over at the sagebrush, seeing the very flat land, heat, it was beginning to get hot, brought back a lot of memories and a lot of feelings that I had forgotten. First of all was a feeling of sadness because my mother and father are no longer here, because my sister and my brother-in-law have also passed on, and the feeling of sadness because I wondered how they survived for 3.5 years in this God-forsaken land. I was very fortunate because I went out earlier as a student, but they stayed, and I thought of what life must have been like for them, day in and day out. Then I had feelings of anger that we were put into that situation, put into a camp with no charges against us, no opportunity for us to make a defense, no trial by jury. In other words, our civil rights were totally taken away, and we were put into camp. I guess the other feeling I had was one almost of, a feeling of warmth, that I thought of the friendships that I had made in camp, of the people who had been there with me, and a lot of cooperation and a lot of love that I could. The fact that there was no sabotage, no instance of espionage at all, and that all of us managed to survive and live, and some of us had happy moments in that camp. Certainly one for me was that I met my husband and I got married, after camp, and there were a lot of marriages that went on at that time. And then the other feeling that came over me, that some kind of satisfaction in the sense that we were no longer victims, but we are really very active in our lives in making sure that civil rights is available to all of our citizens, that we are able to talk about what had happened to us in camp and make sure that this never happens again. We were able, after 46 years, pass a bill through the House of Representatives and the Senate, and to have the President Reagan signed in 1988, a bill in which the American government apologized for the mistake that they had made in putting us into camp, and also gave us a sum of $20,000 to the survivors, the people who were living at the time President Reagan signed the bill. And this was supposed to take care of the fact that we had been deprived of our freedom for many, many days, many years, and also for the fact that we lost so much because of the suddenness of being put into camp. But let me tell you a little bit more about myself and what happened to me. You heard Estelle's story, and I think if you asked everyone who was in camp, they all have a story, so mine is just one of many. When Pearl Harbor happened, just like all other Americans, we were very shocked and upset that this would happen. But we also had another feeling, and that was a feeling of trepidation, of what would happen to us, and anxiety, because we knew we had the faces of the enemy. We also knew that from the time that my father came in 1906, there had been a whole systematic pattern of discrimination against Japanese Americans, that my father was not able to become a citizen because of racist laws, that he was not able to marry outside of the race, that he was not able to own land because of Alien Land Act of 1913. So we knew through our lives that there were all kinds of discriminatory against us, which made us even more anxious about what would happen to us because of the war against Japan. I was going to the University of California at that time. I was 20 years old, and I was a senior. My father was taken away about the second or third week after Pearl Harbor. I think over 2,000 people had been on the list of the I because they were community leaders and because they might have been teachers of the Japanese language or people who were teachers of some of the flower arrangement and things of that kind, also Buddhist ministers and priests, so that you had a lack of leadership in the Japanese American community because people were taken away, the leaders were taken away. We were called in Berkeley because some of the people began to go, they were worried about their families. And the administration called us together and said to us that we should stay in school as long as we can. And they added at the very end, you know you're American citizens and that you have your rights, so don't worry. Well, 2.5 months later, February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066, which sanctioned the events which led eventually to all of us being put into a camp. Again, we were given, our family was given a notice of 5 days in which to leave. And I don't know how it is with you. It takes us more than 5 days to prepare for a trip to Europe today. But at that time, we had to get rid of our businesses, all of them material goods. If you had a farm, you had to get rid of your farm. You had to get, again, people to come in and take care of your things if you felt that you wanted to, or you felt you were able to get people to help you. It also meant people had to leave their jobs, people who were just starting their careers or whatever. So there was a tremendous material but also a psychological loss for all of us. Because my father was taken away, my sister, who was 24 years of age, became the head of the family. And in many instances, people became heads of families, women, young girls. We know of a friend of ours whose 14-year-old girl was called the head of the family, had to make all the arrangements, both with her surroundings, people around her, and also in terms of the government, because we had all these papers to sign, shots to take, etc. So you could imagine how difficult that was. And then, again, we didn't know where we were going, and we didn't know how long we were going to stay. We had no idea of what kind of conditions we would face, and we wondered what was going to happen to us at the end of the war. We were told we could only take what we could carry. I noticed in Estelle's film, they talk about 100 pounds. We were one of the first to go, so we could only take what we could carry. And I think of my friends who had babies, who had such a difficult time to take baby things like diapers and all, in addition to their own clothes, so that most of us went with very little things. And because we're from the Bay Area, we were totally unprepared for the cold and the heat and the kind of conditions we found ourselves in. We left, and we found that we were in Santa Anita. And Santa Anita is a racetrack right near Los Angeles, Pasadena. And this was a temporary arrangement. We knew that we were in what they called, quote, an assembly center. And so we knew that we were going to be put into permanent camps later on. Santa Anita had some green because there were orange trees fairly close by. So you could occasionally get a waft of sweet orange blossoms. And we could see some greenery trees. And we could also occasionally the cars that were going by in some of the streets. So it was, because we were in a temporary camp, there was a feeling almost of excitement of being in a place. We lived in a horse stall, and there were 6 of us living in a horse stall for 6 months. And if you've ever been in a horse stall and you know that, the stench, the difficulty of living in quarters like that, totally without any privacy of any kind. We had a latrine that was far away that we had to go to. And the first couple of weeks we had like green bologna sandwiches, which made us all sick, and we were all rushing to the latrine at the same time. And the conditions were such that there were no partitions between, no doors, etc. And we just felt that our dignity was totally taken away. So again, that sense of sorrow and anger was really mixed together. Because I was going to the university, and there were not too many of us because the median age of the second generation, the citizen group, which is my group, 2/3 people who went into camp were citizens, and the other 1/3 were people who couldn't become citizens. So that for us, most of us were 18, 19. I think in May's book she says that the median age of the girls in camp was 17. So you could see that we were all very new, very naive and totally unprepared, and I was given the task of developing education and recreation for 19,000 people. If you could imagine what it was like going from the Ivy Towers at the University of California into the horse and having this responsibility. Therefore, I didn't have too much time to really sit and think about things because we were busy, one thing after another, developing all kinds of activities. We also had, for example, we developed schools, and people talked about the fact that the people who were evacuated, the people in the camps, took initiative, so that there were people who took initiative to develop preschools, because the children had to do. We developed elementary schools, and it was really, to me, the saddest part of being in the camp was to listen to the children sing every morning. They sang God Bless America and did the Pledge of Allegiance. And those of us who are older had knots in our stomach knowing that the American government were the ones who put us into the camp. There was, again, problems in terms of health conditions and all, which some of the others will talk about. But we were there for 6 months, and during that time, I did receive my diploma in camp. And to me, this was very treasured because it was really a link to the outside world. We felt so alone and so separated from the American community. We went to Topaz and again went to Utah. And again, when I had gone back, so many of the things that happened to us in Utah came to me. Because again, problems were beginning to appear in the camps in terms of personal relationships, social kinds of arrangements or whatever. I became a social worker or head of a social work unit. And for the first time, I really began to see the results of this kind of experience on families of Japanese Americans. We've always been a very close-knit group. And let me add that experience from before the war carried us through after, but while we were in camp, there was a lot of difficulty. My mother, for example, used to cry because nobody ate dinner with her, because everybody was busy eating dinner or eating their lunch and dinner with their friends. We were all very active in our own circles, and people, brother, who was 16, she never saw him from morning to night because he would go to school and then stay out and play with everybody, and he was in sports and all. So she felt that the family was disappearing. My father, who had been picked up by the FBI, had been given an individual trial and returned on the basis that he was not a threat to the American government and to the American forces. So he was returned to us when we were in. He became a block social worker, a block leader, and he became, we used to call them the blockheads because he was the head of the block. But you know, they took care of a lot of the little problems, things like how to give out coal to people, etc. Again, one of the things that we faced were the conditions of living in a desert. And I think of the terrible dust storms that used to come out all over and cover all of us with dust. And if you had any kind of problem in terms of breathing, if you had asthma or if you had hay fever, forget it, because you were really sick. And people did die. Our rates of, I think, of death were pretty high compared to outside. The education in camp was very poor. My brother, who high school, will talk about the fact that sometimes they'd have 4 or 5 different teachers teaching them in different classes during the year. That we didn't have books, especially at the beginning, and when we did get them, they were discarded books from the Utah education system. But I think the part that was most awful to all of us was the fact that we were surrounded, both in Santa Anita and in Topaz, with barbed wire fences. Now, the fences I saw that she drew were very low. Ours was much, much higher, and it was to prevent us from going outside. And the watchtowers also had soldiers with their guns pointed at us. Now, one of the reasons that the American government gave was they put us into camp to protect us. And some of the people told their children that, you know, the American government cares about you, and they put camp because they wanted to make sure you were safe. So my friend, who was at that time 12 years old, said she and her friend skipped all around the camp and came back to their father and said, well, Daddy, if they're going to protect us, why are the guns facing inside and not outside? And I think very soon people realized that, you know, that was just a funny excuse. I did want to read one. I do a lot of oral interviews. We're part of the Historical Society, and we've come into some interesting kind of things that people have talked about or written. So one of the women said, she was 18 years old at the time and very, very upset because she was going to be a lead. She had her essay had been accepted as a winner on Americanism, and before she could go to claim her prize, get to read it on a statewide basis, she was put into camp, and so she was extremely upset about what had happened. So she writes, or she told us, and how could you sleep on a mattress of straw at 130 degrees? She went to Poston, which was even hotter than Topaz. So we threw it all out and watered our cots. Everyone would line up with their cots at Fawcett, sleepy-eyed. It was such a funny feeling. We would look up, and the sky was so beautiful at night, and the coyotes and foxes are howling, but such a lonely feeling, wondering if anyone cared. Here we are, abandoned, forgotten, thrown away. It was an awful feeling. I think she captured that for us because when we were in Topaz, we realized that we were in a permanent camp, and we wondered what was going to happen. Well, eventually what happened was that in February of 1943, which was not too, I think about 6 months after we had gone to Topaz, the American government decided that they could no longer really keep us into camp. And so they began to encourage people to leave the camp. For one thing, we were very expensive to have 10 camps, which eventually ended up with 120,000 people in the camps. And the fact that there were people outside who were screaming for laborers to work in the fields. And here there were all these Japanese American able-bodied men who had experience in agriculture, because before World War II, the Japanese Americans had really worked on agriculture, so that instances, for example, in some of the truck farming, they might have controlled 70% of some of the crops, 50% of some of the others. So as a result, there was a cry for labor from the camps. And so the government also realized that, I think after after some of the battles, that the Japanese government or the Japanese army was not able to invade the United States, etc. So for many reasons, they pushed upon getting us out of camp. And so short-term leaves were developed, and I was able to go out on a student leave. And again, permanent leaves were also made possible. But to do this, they went through a series of events again, which tore the camp apart. For example, they had 2 questions. We had to fill a long questionnaire, 2 questions which really stumped the people who were died. The 2 questions were 27 and 28. And one of the questions was, do you forswear allegiance to Japan? And the other question was, will you be loyal to the American government, and would you volunteer or serve in the army? And so these 2 questions were very difficult because this was the American government that had put us into camp and who were asking the Japanese Americans to fight for the American cause and also for the Japanese Americans to volunteer in a segregated unit and all. So again, lots of dissension in camp, lots of different answers in camp. The other question that our parents had difficulty with was, do you forswear allegiance to Japan? None of us, those of us who were citizens, had no allegiance to Japan. We never felt that we were Japanese. For our parents, they had no other citizenship. If you took away the Japanese citizenship, they were not able to get American citizenship, and so they would be people without a country. So as a result of a lot of discussion and a lot of block meetings, the American government did change that one to make it, would you be loyal to the United States and not and somewhat to point out that you're not going to do anything negative or whatever. But the camp really had a hard time with that. And one of the things that happened to me was we had big discussions on do you go yes, yes, or no, no. And the people who eventually decided, for many different reasons, why they were going to say no and opt for going to Japan were people who had many different reasons for doing that. Some who were discouraged by what had happened to them, not only from the discrimination and the camp experience, but also because they had been discriminated before, couldn't get jobs, couldn't get housing, etc., whatever. And so there were people who were very discouraged about their experience in America, others who had lived in Japan for a while and decided that they would like to go back to Japan, others who went because they had children in Japan who were unable to come to the United States, were caught in Japan, and wanted to find out what happened to them. So again, many different reasons why no. All of them were put into another camp, which is called Tule Lake. But in the discussion that happened, I was participating in some of it. And in our block, most of the people were young, like my brother. There were 16, 17, 18-year-old boys. And we had two people who were very open in talking about Japan and wanted everybody to do, for the whole block to go no. They were developing an atmosphere of, I felt, was just getting out of hand. And so I got up, and I was, again, a young woman, 20 years old, and spoke out and said to everybody, think carefully about your answers. Don't let anybody put you in a place where you really need to think for yourself, and you need to think about your future and what this would mean. And because there was a big silence in the hall because no woman had ever spoken up before, and I was very young. And people, the meeting disintegrated and people went on, and most of the young people there, almost all of them, decided that they would stay in America and would go yes, yes. Let me add that it was very difficult for my parents. My father and mother were castigated by some of the people who were against, against yes, yes, and they threatened to beat me up, and they told my father that it was his fault because he sent me to the university and therefore I thought too much. And so, it was just kind of a very peculiar thing, but I did go out very quickly after that because there were threats to my well-being. Years later, it was interesting because my sister met the man who had been so vociferous, and he apologized and he said, your sister was right, that we should have thought more carefully about what we were going to do. And so it was an incident that happened. Well, shortly afterwards, I got a student leave, and I was going to go to Chicago, the University of Chicago. And again, the instructions that I got, which will explain a lot about why so many people remained silent so long. I was told, don't speak Japanese. Secondly, don't get in a group of more than 3 Japanese Americans so that we don't look conspicuous. Thirdly, we were told, if you did anything that called attention to yourself, you will stop the whole relocation program. So we felt a real sense that we had to follow through with what they had told us because we wanted our sisters and other people, our friends, to all come out of camp. Well, so we did relocate. I did go to the University of Chicago eventually, but I got married in between, had children, etc. And I guess I'd like to stop off by saying that at the same time, I think somebody's going to talk about the experience of the men in the military, and if not, I'll talk about that later. But there were a couple of things I want to mention. One was Mr. Floyd Schmo, who is with the Religious Society of Friends, had visited the camp, and this is a quote, he said, "I wish to emphasize one point, that although these camps were called assembly centers, relocation centers, they were in fact prisons. They were concentration camps. They were prisoners of war. They looked like prison camps, and they had the same emotional and psychological impact upon the internees that prisons have on any person so interned." Thank you. May asked me if I would say something about this poster that you see in front of you. And this is a very interesting story because it had been told for years, because the American military had told the men who were in this particular unit they are not to talk about it. We didn't find out about it till about 5 years ago, if you could believe that. And what had happened was that the Japanese American men in their combat unit was, again, let me add, they were the most highly decorated unit in the whole history of the American Army. I'm talking not about WW2. In the whole history of the American Army, they were the most highly decorated for their size and length of service. And they, together with the had combined together with the volunteers from Hawaii and fought all over Italy and went into Germany. And what you will see there is a poster talking about I think this is something that he was working on, in which they had a reunion with some of the people who had been in the camps in Germany and in Dachau. Now, Dachau had many camps, and one of the Japanese American units were the first people to go there, and they said they unlocked the gates at Dachau, in one of the camps at Dachau, and they saw these people they could not believe what they saw, because they also knew what was happening to us, but they saw something so tragically awful that they said that it remains in their minds today. They saw people who were dying, and just stacks of corpse, and it was just and they saw the gas ovens. So they had a opportunity, and they went to Israel. They've been to Israel to meet with some of the survivors. And Rudy tells this story. Rudy Tokyo is one of the people, and he said when he talked to people about this, about going over to Dachau, some of the people said, "I don't believe it." And so he said when he went to Israel, he went to the Knesset, and he spoke to some people, one of the men who said, "You know, when I remember being carried out by somebody, and I could not see his face because I was just really such a bad shape. But he said, I did remember the emblem that he had on the patch that he had. And the patch was one of the torch with a hand. And that was the emblem of the 442nd. So we feel a very strong identity with the Jewish people.
Thank you, Chizu. I should mention that Chizu is not only unusual today, she was unusual before the war, in that not many Japanese American women of the second generation went to college. First of all, we were young. And secondly, if there was a chance for anybody in the family to go to college, the boys got to go. How she managed to get there. So we're glad she did. All right. Margaret Saito is from Oakland. She's been involved in teaching English as a second language. She's frequently called upon to speak at the Oakland area elementary schools. And now she's a budding actress. She's involved in community theater with a group of elders who call those Stage Bridge. She's married. Her husband is sitting over there and is the mother of 4 children. Margaret says that she prefers talking, sitting down. So here she is, Margaret Saito.
Is this on? Forgive me for sitting, but if I stand, the quaking louder than the voice, and the voice is pretty loud. So, I was 17 when Pearl Harbor happened, high school senior, and my whole world consisted of school activities and my home. The only thing I knew about the world, unlike 17-year-olders today who are very knowledgeable, was what I read in the paper. The front page, well, just the headlines, the sport page, sport section, the whole section, and of course the comics. And so when Pearl Harbor came, it was a terrible shock. And I was walking to my father's store. He had a florist. He was a florist, and he had a flower shop. And I was walking there, and this car came along and came up on the sidewalk and almost hit me. And I was so surprised, I said, "Ha, you missed me. Try better luck next time." And afterwards, now when I think of it, what a stupid, but at that time, I didn't know what was going on. So about a week later, after Pearl Harbor, I came home from school and the store was closed. And I went home, my mother was there crying, and my father was gone. And she said the FBI came and told him to close up the shop and go home, and for her to go home, and that they were taking him, and they wouldn't tell her where they were taking him or why they were taking him or anything. He happened to be president of the Japanese Association of Oakland at that time. And a week later, he came home. And it wasn't until 1968 when he wrote his autobiography. And I read that during World War I in 1916, he worked for the United States Postal Census Bureau. And I guess those records turned up, and so he was released. We went to Tanforan, which was another race track, and had a lot of the same experiences that Chizu did. I found out the very first day, that all Japanese are not honest. I had received a watch as a going-away gift from a good neighbor, and went to the latrine and forgot I had the watch and got off to wash my hands. And when I went back to the horse stall and back to the latrine, it was gone, and I just couldn't believe that. Secondly, I learned as I worked in the mess hall as a children's baby food distributor that you have to lie a lot. The portions that were given to the children were so meager that I didn't see how any child could survive with that. So I doubled my order to the main kitchen who sent out the food. And until a few months later, when they went and came and took a count of how many babies there were in our mess hall area, and I found out that I was way off base and was cut down. But anyway, I'm not used to doing those kind of things, and so it was difficult for me. We went from Tanforan to Topaz on a train, and when I got there, the units were not completed yet. The walls between one block, 12 barracks to a block, a mess hall, a laundry and latrine room. That's what one block consisted of. And the barracks consisted of small rooms on the end and larger as they came in. 6 families could live there, and Some families that had many children took over 2 rooms. There were 5 of us, and so we had 1 room, which my mother tried to partition off by hanging and things for my 2 brothers and myself. And the walls went only partway up not up to the ceiling. So what you said here could be heard way over here. That I thought was a lack of privacy. But then I went to the latrine. Picture seats sitting in a row like this, and another row of toilet seats sitting in a row like this, facing. No partitions in between, nothing in front. You could carry on conversations or whatever you wanted to do.
A meeting.
Yes. And the same with the showers. It's just a wall of showers, which for a 17-year-old was horrifying. It was about 6 months later that they finally got at least the walls up in between. I think, like Jesus said, one of the hardest parts about living in the camp as a family was the loss of control by the parents. We all went to them to eat, so naturally everybody went and sat with their friends. They didn't sit with their parents. Children stayed out late because there was nothing to do in one little room at home. And I think mothers in particular had a very difficult time because it was a very important age to teach your own family traditions, your own family values, and you couldn't do this. As soon as the hospital was completed, I applied there as a nurse's aide. I have no other skills. And I think there were 4 doctors, I don't know how many nurses, and a whole bunch of nurses' aides. Now, imagine this bubble-headed 17-year-old who was given 2 weeks training and then was given the responsibility of giving patients shots, injections, and then having to be responsible for the isolation ward all by herself on a midnight shift, where the head nurse came once during the whole 8 hours. I worked in pediatrics where we had an outbreak of mumps, and they isolated the children and said, anybody want to volunteer to help with the mumps? And of course I had had mumps, I thought, so I raised my hand and found out later on I hadn't had mumps, but I never got mumps either, so I was very fortunate. I worked in the men's ward. Well, we all took turns working in all the wards, but when I was working in the men's ward, I had a patient who had an eye infection. He was supposed to get a change of hot compress over his eye every 20 minutes. I started off in the morning every 20 minutes, and I was doing pretty good. And I changed the compress, and I'd run and make somebody's bed and then come back and change the compress, do something else. I got sidetracked. Next thing I know, it's a half an hour, maybe 45 minutes later, and this poor man's been laying there without a change. Finally, after enduring this kind of neglect for the whole morning, he told me in the afternoon, just bring me the hot water, I'll do it myself. This is self-preservation, and many people did this in the hospital because they couldn't get the attention that they needed. We were all running around like chickens with our heads cut off. And the wonderful thing about it was there were very few complaints against us. It's not our fault that we weren't able to take care of the person as we should have, because they knew our situation also, and they sympathized with us. I was very grateful for that. I think due to inadequate staffing, the poorly equipped hospital that we had, it was a very basic minimum hospital that we had, insufficient and poor quality of food that we had, and no consideration for people who had special needs, either dietarily or medically, that there were many unnecessary deaths in all of these camps. You hear all kinds of stories. Some people tried to write, because they would run short of insulin, diabetics were not able to get their treatments, or they would only get whatever they did in order to make it stretch out until the next shipment came, if it came. People got desperate and they would write to friends outside to get medication or any other needs that they had, if they had the money to do that. Well, as all this was going on, I was writing a letter to this soldier who was drafted before the war. He was in dental school, and the whole class was told not to start their practice because as soon as they graduated, that they were going to all be drafted, which they were. And so I was writing to him, and one day he came to visit, and the letters got longer and better. And well, it started out with I was writing to him about how some boy was treating me or something or other. And he would give me his brotherly advice. And then pretty soon it got came around so that we were writing about each other and to each other. And so when he came in to visit his family who lived in the same block, he proposed. My father said, "Better young than ever." And so within the 10 days' time that he had for his furlough, we were allowed to go out to Salt Lake City to get our blood tests, to get our license and whatever. My cousin, who was born and raised in Salt Lake City, gave up her shoe ration. They had stamps for food and for clothing, and gave up her shoe ration that I could buy a pair of white shoes with my wedding gown. In camp, my mother, my future mother-in-law, and an old church friend who was a wonderful sewing teacher and seamstress went down to the cooperative, bought some material, and made my wedding gown. In 3 days, when I came back to camp, my gown was made. And every female relative in my family part of the hem as a good luck. So I was overwhelmed by that. Then I noticed that there was no sugar on the table every time I went to the mess hall. Every meal there was no sugar on the table. I can't drink coffee without sugar. And found out afterwards that the cook was saving all the sugar for my cake. The block had been invited to the wedding. It was a church wedding, and I had a maid of honor, and he had a best man. And we had our reception in the mess hall. And this beautiful three-layered little cake came out with sweet. It was so good. And our honeymoon was spent on a train, sitting and standing in an aisle on a train going to Alabama. Well, 3 months later, I'm back in camp, pregnant. He was getting ready to go overseas. So the baby was due in February. And in January, our block had an outbreak of food poisoning from the bad food at the mess hall. And the baby was starting to come down a little bit now, so she's heavy. And I got hemorrhoids. Well, if you've never had hemorrhoids, you don't know Anyway, I had to go to the hospital, and they took about 5 days trying to figure out what in the heck they were going to do, and and I didn't want to tell my about that because he can't do anything about it anyway. But my father writes to him, and he says, "It keeps coming out, and they keep pushing it back in." So the dear husband, he thinks it's the baby. So he finally got a call through to the hospital. I'm standing there, nurse's station with the only telephone, and it's visiting hour. People are passing back and forth, and I'm trying to explain to him it's hemorrhoids, not the baby, it's hemorrhoids. And he can't hear because of he says, "What?" And so I'm shouting, and everybody in the hospital knew that I had hemorrhoids. After the baby was born, things got a little topsy-turvy for me. If in the middle of the night she starts to cry, you try to keep her quiet because it disturbs the whole barrack. People at the other end can hear her. And I tried to keep her kind of covered with a pillow. It's a wonder I didn't smother her. But I used to try to keep her covered with a pillow until she settled down, or tried to feed her, or whatever it was that I thought she needed. And then on top of that, washing the diapers got to be a chore for me because the camp kept running out of hot water. The blocks kept running out of hot water. And especially in the evening when people are taking all their showers and stuff like this. So I used to try to get up at 5 in the morning and go to the washroom. And every one of those tubs is filled with somebody else's diapers. I mean, all the mothers are out there trying to wash their diapers with hot water. And so I ended up doing it at 2 in the morning. It was easier for me to stay awake and just do it at 2 in the morning than to try to get up early, try to beat those other people up early in the morning. I think one of the things that really helped me through all of this was the support of the family and the support of the people in the block that were still there. It was the community love that you get that really sustains you through all these kinds of things. And at the time they seemed terrible, but now when I think about it, we all managed. And my father-in-law used to come every morning, early in the morning, and he would mop my floor for me. He would sprinkle the floor with water, and then he would sweep, and then he would mop. I couldn't understand this. This is a lot of work. I mean, as far as, mop it once is fine. But he said, you sprinkle the water on the dust so it doesn't come up into the air. And then you sweep it so that there isn't so much mud on your mop. And then you mop. And he did this daily because the dust would seep in from the windows and through the doors and through the cracks in the walls. And he just wanted to keep his little granddaughter breathing good air. My father was a super patient. He came to this country when he was 19, and he believed in this country. When we were born, we were raised to be true red, white, and blue United States citizens. He didn't want to hear anything bad spoken about this country. He taught us that we should respect this country, we should honor those who run the country, and that we should never break any of their laws, that we should follow their laws. He was one of those that Chizu talked about that told us, the government is sending us to camp to protect us, so we will do as they say. And we followed. I think I'm over most of the anger of being put into camp and all of this. I think I get a little angry when I think about how this government has treated these citizens with so little respect. I still get very angry every time I think about my husband in a United States Army uniform not being allowed to go back to California to help his parents pack and move to go to camp. Thank you.
My story is very similar to Margaret's, and I'm sure I can't tell it as well, so I won't tell it. But I was also 17 years old when I entered camp. And my husband, who is sitting there, went to the same camp. He was my boyfriend. And in those days, of course, well, we saw each other every day, night and day. These days, you know, sex was verboten, so what did you do? But you got married. So we got married when I was 18 years old. And a year later, we had a child. And as Margaret had said, the medical care there was very inadequate, so that our child was born with dysentery, and people thought that he was going to die, but he eventually recovered. My sister's child, who was born breech, died. And many, when you go to camp, you will see that many of the, when you go to visit, you will see many of the tombstones that are up there are of little babies who died in camp. I'm going to cut this short because we need to have a question and answer period. I'm sure that you have questions you want to ask. Let me just point out this curriculum guide to those of you who are going to be teachers. It sits at the Sonoma County Office of Education and goes over the things that we've been talking about. There's a brief history. It tells, it gives you some lesson plans, and also gives you a great deal of resources. So it's at the Sonoma County Office of Education. Okay, we're open for questions. Yes?
I've been wondering sometime, property rights were really trumped, so they're really private. What in the long term, since the internment, was there ever done to restore property rights? What percentage of people have managed? You had no place to go back to, I presume, and the properties were or otherwise. What in the way of restoration has occurred?
The question is that about property rights, and those people who had property rights, what kind of, are you talking about a compensation they received, or did they have, are you asking?
If you owned a home, for example,
yes.
You had land, or you had some form of property which was taken from you.
Okay. Would you like to answer, Chizu or
Sure.
Margaret?
In terms of property rights or whatever, they were totally gone. In other words, you could not get it back if you left it. And so a lot of people did leave their things because they only had 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, and could not find somebody to buy it. Other people were more fortunate in that they had friends that they could leave their property with. And so, for example, in my case, my father was able to find a tenant in his hotel who would then take it over for the duration. We'd never received any money from it, but when we came back, the hotel was there. So you had individual differences. many of the people in the farms had a very difficult time before the evacuation, and at a time when there was a lot of speculation about what was going to happen to us, they asked the government whether they should plan to plant crops, and they were told they need to, otherwise they would be considered saboteurs. So then they planted, you know how, if you know anything about farming, how much money goes into that planting period. And so they planted, but before they could reap the harvest, they were put into camp and somebody else came in and just took the farm over. So there was a lot of loss. If you look at the statistics of the Japanese in 1940, and the main, occupation was agriculture. When they came back, it was very, very small. I don't know what the percentage is now, but it's very small. And when you go to the third generation, which is our children, again, they have left. So the percentage of people in agriculture is very small.
Thank you. Yes?
I was wondering if you know of any sort of organized resistance that occurred?
The question is, do we know of any organized resistance that occurred at the time of the evacuation?
Well, but yeah, when people were being ordered to do this, either
Ordered.
yourselves or other Americans.
I don't think there was any organized resistance. One of the points that I want to make is a thing like this just doesn't happen overnight. I mean, there was this, as Chizu had mentioned, kind of prejudice that started with immigration, and came right down to 1940. We had been intimidated a great deal by that prejudice, in that we weren't able to go to certain kinds of places. That was not allowed. We were not to live in certain areas and so forth. So I think we were all very cowed by that, and I don't know of any organized resistance. In camp there was some organization, and also there were a group of men who refused to be drafted from camp. By way of irony, of course, people were drafted from camp where they were sent because they were and my very own husband was drafted from camp.
Could I answer that too?
Sure.
Yeah. There was no organized resistance, but there were individual people who did make who wanted to test the constitutionality. And there are 3 men whose cases did come up before the Supreme Court, Minyasui and Gordon Hirabayashi and Korimatsu. And these 3 men resisted. One of them refused to obey the curfew, another refused to go into camp, and another refused, both of them. And what happened to them is very interesting, because their cases came up to the Supreme Court, and they were, on the basis of military necessity, the Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional to put us into the camp. What happened then was that for long periods of time, this was the law of the land. Then in the 1980s, Professor Irons, who is with the University, system, San Diego, was making a research of some other topic totally unconnected with the Japanese Americans. And he came across some documents which showed that the American government, when it made the case to the Supreme Court, lied and omitted information that should have been available, information that showed that we had been adjudged loyal, that that this was not military necessity, actually. And so those cases came up, and they were coram nobis cases, and they were overturned. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll take one more question. Hi, Flora.
Were there any Japanese Americans who, in fact, were somehow affected by the McCarthy appearance?
Are you talking about the 40s and the 50s? Okay. Margaret, you want to tackle that one?
I don't know. I mean,
know of any.
you were already judged not loyal, but I imagine then everybody passed back into society. Were there any further ramifications from the government with them hounding you in any way whatsoever? Maybe that's what I'm really asking.
I'm not sure that hounding is an appropriate word. But things began to get much better around the 50s. And in fact, in 1952, the Walter, what was that?
Walter McCarran Act.
Walter McCarran Immigration Act was put into law, which allowed then for our parents to become citizens and also for some more immigration to take place. So with a lot of effort on the part of the Japanese American Citizens Leagues and groups, that sort of thing began to happen. I know that when the Japanese Americans first came back to the West Coast, which didn't happen until 1945, until the war was over, there was a great deal of resistance from people in the neighborhoods. We don't want Japs, signs went up, and all sorts of harassment, things like that.
I think generally, in terms of if you look at American history too, you'll find after World War II that there was certainly a very big push on the part, including, for example, Truman, stopped segregation in the army and things of that kind. There was a very big push on the Four Freedoms, which were a part of our background. So I think there's a difference in the way we were treated. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your being here.
It is so itchy.